So the second card that we are going to create is this Santa and Sleigh card, and we're going to do a bit of watercolor-ish-ing with some alcohol inks. So I have bottles that have alcohol ink in them. They're about a quarter of the alcohol ink from the bottle, and the rest is isopropyl. So it's a diluted solution. It's going to lighten the color a little bit, and it's just going to help it flow around the card. So the first step is we are going to stamp and emboss the image. This gives us a little tiny bit of a raised area where the image is. It's not enough that if you put a ton of alcohol ink on it, it's going to hold it in. It is only going to help slightly with kind of keeping it all in place. So I'm using some Brilliance ink here. It's a really nice black ink, and I'm going to use clear embossing powder. You want to use clear embossing powder with alcohol inks because the alcohol ink does start to break down the embossing, and with clear powder you don't really notice it. If you used a color, you would start to notice that it is breaking down. So once again, my piece of paper is bigger than I need it to be. It's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. Once I'm done, I'm going to cut it down to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. These measurements will be on your supply list, so you don't need to remember them. All right. Let's put the clear powder on. And you'll want to make sure that it's on all of the different parts of ink before we melt it with the heat gun. There we go. I think some of the ink dried super quick, but that's okay. Now I'm going to use an embossing gun to melt it. So this blows heat or emits heat to melt the powder. It doesn't blow air. I realized after I turned the heat gun on there that I had kind of half a sentence there. So you don't want to use a blow dryer, which will dry out the ink and just blow air and end up blowing your powder off. You want to use an embossing tool that emits heat and just melts the powder where it is. So the first thing I'm going to do is do the sky. And the reason I'm doing the sky is if by chance I go over any areas, I can color over top of them with the next colors, and it's a little bit more forgiving. So these bottles that I'm using have a really fine tip to them, and I'm pressing pretty gently. I don't want to press out a whole bunch of ink. I'm just trying to color in those areas. But I'm trying to get the bottom part a little bit lighter, and then we'll do the darker part on the top. And I can do that a little bit quicker because I'll have the bottom part done. So you see some of these colors are kind of going over the lines, and that's because that embossing makes a slight ridge. It's really not a huge bump, so it's not going to really hold anything in. It's just going to help it. And this is especially going to be noticeable when we go to like paint the trees and the buildings and stuff like that. When we go to do those ones, I'm going to be using these here. They're actually disposable like eyeliner applicators that I found online that work perfect for this. So I'm going to put some clear isopropyl alcohol down, and then some of the blue. I want that clear to kind of help this move around a little bit. And then I'm going to use my brush to try to help move it around a little bit more. I want to get that sky covered before that alcohol ink dries. Alcohol ink dries super, super quick, so there's not a whole lot of work time with it. And I'm not really careful, I'm not concerned with getting it completely even. I like having some lighter areas and some darker areas. That makes it a more natural sky to me. But I am wanting some of that blue to cover the whole sky. And put a little bit more on if you want. Just keep in mind, if the ink has dried around it, you are going to get some lines. Alcohol ink just does that. But by adding the isopropyl ahead of time, it shouldn't be too dry quite yet. All right, I think that's good for my sky. But you'll see I got lots of blue in the trees here, and that is totally fine. So I'm going to move that out of the way so that I don't grab it. I am done with the aqua color and the denim color. I'll write the colors that I'm using on the supply list so that you know that as well. I don't think I'll need the clear isopropyl, and now that I said I'm done with the aqua color, I just realized that I'm actually not. So I'm going to put a little bit in here. I'm going to lift it up with my brush. I want a little bit of that aqua color on the snow. It's going to hide these bits that go down below the line, and it's also just going to give a little bit of shadow to that snow. There we go. And you can go down as much as you want or leave it fairly high up. There we go. Now I'm going to do some green for the trees. And I just put a few drops. This is a little dish that's got a little well in it. You don't want to put too much alcohol ink in there because, like I said before, alcohol ink evaporates and dries fairly quickly. So if you put too much in your bowl, it's just going to evaporate on you while you're working. Might as well put just a little bit in and add more when you need it. That way it doesn't go to waste. Now, any of these wells from previous projects or from before, I typically will reuse them again and just put a similar color ink in there. And you can see with doing these trees, I work from the top down to the bottom, and I try to work fairly quickly so that my ink hasn't totally dried, so that I'm not getting lines between the light and the dark. And the beauty part about this image is if the ink happens to go slightly out of the lines, it still looks good. And the aqua and the navy that are on some of these trees that have gone over the lines from when I was doing the sky, it'll blend with the green for the trees and just give it a little bit of a different shade. I need a little bit more green. This big tree is the one that you chances are going to have a harder time keeping the ink wet while you're coloring. But I tend to use a motion kind of like the branches would be, so that if I do get lines, it just looks like texture. Oops, wrong color. And you can see that I'm doing my trunks the green. The color that I have for my buildings is terracotta, and I'm going to go back once I'm done my buildings, and I'm going to put terracotta over top of that green, and it's just going to make a more brown color. All right, I'm done with those trees. If you want, you can go over one a second or a couple of second time, just make them a little bit darker, just so that your trees aren't all exactly the same shade of green, that there's some lights and darks to it.